This hearing will come to order, and this morning we consider the recent wave of terror that has gripped Israel. In a span of weeks, Palestinian militants have attacked more than 100 Jewish men, women, and children. 10 of those who have been knifed have died. A 2-year-old toddler, a 13-year-old on a bike, a 70-year-old woman on a bus are among those who were wounded. This is terrorism at its core, when anyone who steps outside could be next. And these attacks, mainly stabbings, have been driven by a deliberately misleading message. Palestinian Authority officials and extremist clerics have falsely claimed that Israelis are trying to change the status quo by limiting Muslim access to the Temple Mount al-Aqsa Mosque compound that is holy to both faiths. The calls for killing have been amplified on social media as Arabic hashtags like the knife intifada, poison the knife before you stab, and slaughtering the Jews rapidly spread a message to attack those who are Jewish. Palestinian President Abbas regrettably has joined this hate speech. Israel is contending with a deep-seated hatred nurtured by Palestinian leaders over many years in mosques, in schools, in newspapers, and on television channels. Consider growing up in an environment in which television shows regularly glorify terrorists who have killed Israeli civilians, where you were taught that Jews are subhuman, or watching a small boy interviewed on television who speaks of wanting to be an engineer, in his words, so that I can build bombs to blow up all the Jews, or seeing the family next door receive a generous stipend for their son igniting his suicide vest. Perhaps most concerning, this culture of hate is being cultivated by Palestinian leaders. After being exposed day in and day out to these types of messages for most of their young lives, many of these young people will react. And once the Palestinian president declares, in his words, "We welcome every drop of blood spilled in Jerusalem," there are consequences to that. And it doesn't help when those in the media, or the Secretary of State for that matter, give this incitement a pass. Yes, there are many complexities in the Middle East, but there can be no moral equivalency when children as young as 2 are being stabbed. None. The U.S. should be speaking loudly and clearly. Palestinian officials must work to restore calm and renounce the incendiary statements, and its leadership must be confronted with the questions: how does this incitement serve the interests of Palestinian men, women, or children? How does this lay the groundwork for peace? The international community also has a responsibility. There is the international outcry for the generations of children which are growing up on blind hatred. There is an outcry, but that outcry is pretty muted compared to what I have seen in the international press. We need to amplify that voice. We need to build on some of the things that we've done here in the hearings in order to try to convince the Palestinian Authority to toss these textbooks and go with a lesson plan that teaches coexistence. Given that about 1/3 of the Palestinian Authority's budget is financed through foreign aid, international donors have leverage on this. They should be using that leverage. They could follow the lead of the U.S. Congress and make direct funding of the PA off limits until the incitement stops. This is a very tough time for Israel. It is my hope that President Abbas and others will seek to restore calm in the coming days, and incitement is challenged so reconciliation has a chance. And I now turn to the ranking member for any opening comments that Mr. Elliott Engel of New York might have.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for calling this hearing. Obviously, the Palestinian violence in Israel and the West Bank is reaching a crisis point. Our immediate goal must be to demand that those responsible end this senseless and lawless bloodshed, but it's also important that we seek to understand why this violence has reared up now, while continuing to demonstrate unwavering support for our ally, Israel. I'm glad that our witnesses are here to be part of this conversation. Let me say to all of you, welcome to the Foreign Affairs Committee. It's heartbreaking, I have to say, to wake up seemingly every morning to a new report of a stabbing or a shooting of an innocent civilian in Israel. I can only imagine what it's like for the victims and their loved ones, and no person anywhere should have to live with that kind of fear. And let me just say, for people who have grievances and who feel that the government of Israel hasn't done what it should do, terrorism is not the answer. And I support a two-state solution, but the Palestinians will never get their state on the backs of terrorism. If they think that they can use terrorism to get their state, they are sadly mistaken. And that has to be understood by everyone. These are innocent civilians who have had no role whatsoever in anything. And it's terrorism, pure and simple, when you go and just stab somebody or make them afraid that you're going to harm them when they're just innocent civilians in the street. That is not anything that should in any way, shape, or form be condoned, and there is no moral equivalency. No government anywhere should hesitate to defend its citizens from that sort of violence, and why there would be any question about that baffles me. Israel has the right to defend itself and its people, plain and simple. And we know what the Israelis are up against. This wave of violence isn't some random flare-up. It's the product of years and years of anti-Israel propaganda and indoctrination, some of which has been actively promoted by Palestinian Authority officials and institutions. These ugly ideas have been woven into Palestinian society and media for decades. Books that teach children that Israelis are their enemies, political cartoons depicting Jews as apes and pigs, the glorification of terrorists as martyrs and heroes in a holy war. Every slur, every slogan, every lie told about Israel and Jews is like adding another piece of kindling to the stack. One small spark and it starts burning, and that's what we're seeing today. Now, the best option for stopping these attacks would be for Palestinian leaders to demand an end to the violence and bring those responsible to justice. Unfortunately, that's not what we're hearing from the Palestinian Authority. Instead, we're hearing a false equivalence between terrorists and Israeli law enforcement. We're hearing blame put on the Israelis for defending their people, false claims about changing the status quo on the Temple Mount, lies about the Israelis executing an attacker when that attacker is actually being treated in an Israeli hospital. Statements like these just throw gasoline on the fire. Chairman Royce and I are circulating a letter to President Abbas, imploring him to repudiate this wave of violence and to stop the PA's incitement of this brutality. So much depends on bringing a quick end to these attacks, because in addition to the horrible cost of life and limb, crises like this one play into a much bigger picture. With each drop of blood shed, the goal of a two-state solution becomes harder and harder to reach. Violence and terrorism will never be the foundation of a peaceful future. Palestinians need to put down their knives and guns, and their leaders need to come back to the negotiating table with no preconditions. I sincerely hope, for the sake of Israelis and Palestinians alike, that President Abbas shows real leadership in the days ahead. For now, I think it's important that we continue to speak out against the mayhem that this Palestinian violence has brought to Israel. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses about what's behind this recent violence, how it will be halted, and what, if anything, we can do to help reach that goal more quickly. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Engel. We're going to go to 2 minutes for our chairwoman and ranking member of the Middle East Subcommittee, Ileana Ros-Lehtinen, and then to Ted Deutsch.
Thank you so much, Chairman Royce and Ranking Member Engel, for convening this important and timely hearing and for calling forward the resolution I introduced alongside my friend and South Florida colleague, Congressman Ted Deutsch, House Resolution 293, for markup immediately following today's hearing. As you said, Mr. Chairman, words do have consequences, and so also do actions. And what we have seen for far too long from the Palestinian Authority and Abu Mazen are words and actions that are designed to incite violence, stoke tensions between Israelis and Palestinians, and shut down the path to a peaceful settlement between the two. Why do we see this? Because Abu Mazen is weak and self-serving. This is the only course of action he can take as a charade to attempt to look strong to the Palestinian people, but the Palestinian people have grown tired of his failed leadership, and they don't trust him nor his corrupt allies. So what does he do when the people start to turn on him? He turns them against Israel. When in doubt, the PA blames Israel in order to deflect attention away from its own shortcomings. We will never see peace achieved between the two until we see real leadership from the Palestinians, leaders who are willing to work for the Palestinian people instead of against Israel. The Palestinians need a leader who is willing to reach peace instead of inciting violence, and that man has never been, nor will ever be, Abu Mazen. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Eliana. Mr. Ted Deutsch.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks to the ranking member for moving swiftly to hold this hearing and to examine the official Palestinian incitement as this wave of violent attacks continues in Israel. I want to welcome back the witnesses today. I look forward to a productive discussion, one that I trust and know will be rooted in fact. Let me first say I believe the last 2 weeks of violence in Israel is a direct result of incitement. These attacks aren't about protecting religious rights. They're acts of terrorism. Let me be clear. All violent attacks on innocent civilians must be condemned, regardless of whether the perpetrators are Palestinians or Israelis. And I welcome statements by Prime Minister Netanyahu condemning violent attacks of revenge and warning against vigilantism. But these recent attacks flow directly from Palestinian figures attempting to turn a political conflict into a religious conflict by making false and inflammatory accusations about Israeli actions with respect to the Temple Mount. These kinds of messages have nothing to do with the current political situation between the Israeli government and the Palestinian Authority. When President Abbas himself says, "We welcome every drop of blood spilled in Jerusalem," that sends a dangerous message that violence is the only way to preserve Muslim sites. Unfortunately, incitement within official channels of the PA is nothing new. There are countless examples in official textbooks, social media pages, and television speeches that call for armed conflict or depict Jews as dirty pigs. President Abbas came to power on a platform of nonviolence. He pledged to seek a stable Palestinian state through direct negotiations with Israel. And if this is still his platform, he must speak out to his people. He has yet to condemn one stabbing or armed attack in the past few weeks, instead choosing to go on television and claim that Israel was engaged in the summary execution of children. And as Secretary Kerry said this week, President Abbas has been committed to nonviolence. He needs to be condemning this loudly and clearly, and he needs to not engage in the incitement that his voice has sometimes been heard to encourage. That has to stop. And Mr. Chairman, if officials within the Palestinian Authority never publicly acknowledge the benefits of the cooperation that's taking place between the Palestinian security forces and Israeli forces to calm the situation, if they never prepare their people for what peace looks like, a Palestinian state living side by side next to the Jewish state of Israel, and if their children never see Israel existing on a map in their textbooks, if they continue to refuse to condemn the recent acts of terror, incitement will unfortunately continue, and peace will unfortunately be dramatically harder to obtain. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Deutsch. This morning we're pleased to be joined by a distinguished panel. We have with us Mr. Elliot Abrams, Senior Fellow for Middle Eastern Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations. Prior to this, Mr. Abrams served as the Deputy National Security Advisor in the previous administration. Dr. Jonathan Schanzer is Vice President for Research at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. Dr. Schanzer has written 2 books on the region and served as a counterterrorism analyst at the Department of Treasury. And Mr. David Makovsky is a director and distinguished fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. Mr. Makovsky recently served as a senior advisor to Secretary of State Kerry on the Middle East. And without objection, the witnesses' full prepared statements are going to be made part of the record here, and members will have 5 calendar days to submit any statements, questions, extraneous material for the record. So we'll start with Mr. Abrams. Please summarize your remarks. And let's get the microphone right about there.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for holding this hearing. What leads a teenager to stab or attempt to stab to death someone he or she has never met? Stabbing is the most intimate of attacks. It's not setting a bomb for people you'll never see. It's not shooting from a distance. It's reaching out to someone inches away from you and taking that person's blood. The answer is, I think, the teaching of hate, as the statements you've made indicate. We use the term incitement, but that's a polite way of saying the teaching of hatred, the demonizing and dehumanizing of Jews. Teaching hate by honoring terrorists, teaching hate by telling lies about what's happening on the Temple Mount. You can read in the press sometimes that these killings are the product of poverty and hopelessness or disappointment about the peace process, but you know, there's no more poverty or hopelessness in October than there was in June. That's not the explanation. It doesn't explain the timing. So why now? I think the most logical explanation is these lies about changes at the Temple Mount, that Israel's undermining it or defiling it, and those lies are being repeated not only in the Palestinian media, but by the top Palestinian leadership. Several of you have quoted President Abbas on this question. Once the violence began, the Palestinian leadership, unfortunately, starting with President Abbas, have been feeding it. And again, you've used some of the terrible terminology that he's used. Each drop of blood that was spilled in Jerusalem is pure blood, President Abbas. He accused Israelis of the summary execution of our children in cold blood. This was a reference to a Palestinian teenager who is alive. One could go through lots of examples of the glorification of individual terrorists. Probably the worst is Dalal Mughrabi, a woman who was involved in the killing of 37 civilians, 12 of them children, in a 1978 bus hijacking. She has been turned into an absolute hero. There are schools and summer camps and sports tournaments named after her. The PA celebrated the 31st anniversary of that terrorist attack with an hour-long TV special. The Palestinian Bar Association decided about a week ago to award a great honor to Muhannad Halabi, a 19-year-old who killed 2 Israelis on October 3rd, stabbing them to death in the old city of Jerusalem. They called him a heroic martyr and gave him an honorary law degree. Well, the U.S. government reaction to all this has been to condemn incitement. The problem is that we've been condemning incitement for decades, but we never do anything about it. And it's a bipartisan error. We don't do anything about it under administrations of both parties. Usually there's something else we want more that day or week or month. We want the Palestinians to do something in the UN or not do something in the UN, or we've got a negotiation coming. So what do we do? That's not an easy question, because if you think about, let's cut off every cent for the PA, the first people to tell you, oh, don't do that, will be the government of Israel. Because if the PA collapses, it collapses into their laps. So I've got just 3 suggestions. First, close the PLO office in Washington. And do not let the PA open an office here until there's been real progress in stopping the incitement by PA institutions and officials. Second, if we cannot usefully stop all PA funding, let's try to stop the illegal personal funding, the corruption that is rife there. It's widely known that corruption has increased significantly since Salam Fayyad resigned as prime minister 2.5 years ago. We should be doing more in investigating and preventing corruption. And third, we should keep track of who is doing the incitement that you've referred to. Who are the individuals doing that incitement? And they should be barred from getting visas for the United States, at least for a time. There ought to be a personal price to pay. These are not panaceas, these 3 steps, but they're better than what we usually do, which is, frankly, nothing. But we've seen in the last few weeks that teaching hatred and glorifying terror eventually result in acts of terror that reflect that hatred. So we need to act ourselves. Thank you for inviting me here today. I look forward to any questions you may have.
Chairman Royce, Ranking Member Engel, members of the committee, on behalf of FED, thank you for the opportunity to testify. The current violence can be traced to Palestinian allegations that Israel seeks to change the status quo on the Temple Mount. Israel controls access to the site, but it does not interfere in matters of religious prayer. And over the last year, there have been approximately 4 million Muslims on the site, compared to just 12,000 Jews. Yet the Palestinian media is filled with wild reports that Israel seeks to undermine Muslim rights there, and at the forefront of this campaign is Wafa, the news agency of the PLO. To calm tensions, Israel has barred ministers and parliamentarians from entering the Temple Mount, and when Jews visit, they are forbidden from praying. Israeli security enforces this rather strictly. Unfortunately, Mahmoud Abbas, who is both PLO chairman and Palestinian Authority president, has taken no steps to reduce tensions. In a speech last week, Abbas accused Israel of working to change the status quo, and he accused Israel of terrorism and shooting Palestinian children in cold blood. Abbas now faces some tough choices. He can back a third intifada and ride the support of his people, but the chaos could upend his rule in the West Bank. He also risks invoking the ire of the Israelis, who could easily topple him. If he stands down, he can maintain security cooperation with Israel to fight the domestic forces that threaten his grip on the West Bank, but in so doing, he fails to galvanize his people. This is why Abbas has tacitly embraced the unrest, but has not unleashed PLO or PA forces against Israel. Interestingly, Hamas also has one foot in the uprising and one foot out. Hamas has kept a lid on the violence in Gaza for fear of another war that could devastate their territory, but Hamas is a key driver of the stabbings and other violence in the West Bank and Jerusalem. For Hamas, the benefits of fomenting unrest in the West Bank are two-pronged. They get to challenge Israel and also undermine their political rivals, the Palestinian Authority, which they have tried to unseat for more than a decade. None of this poses a risk to Hamas's grip on Gaza. With neither Abbas nor Hamas fully committed to war, social media has taken an outsized role. One particularly disturbing hub is the Palestine Dialogue Forum, or PLDF, which depicts Jews as monkeys and pigs, Palestinian toddlers wearing Hamas headbands and wielding knives, and worse. They promote hashtags calling for the Jerusalem Intifada and the Knife Intifada. Hamas and Fatah also maintain dangerous social media channels calling for Palestinians to embrace violence. I identify these and many other outlets in my written testimony. Mr. Chairman, amidst all of this, the Obama administration has issued talking points that have arguably led the Palestinians to believe that their violence is justified. To put it mildly, this is unhelpful. I'm often asked whether this is a third intifada. In short, I don't know, but I can offer the following 6 suggestions. Number 1 is halt Iranian cash to Hamas. Iran's financial ties with Hamas are well documented. After Iran begins to receive sanctions relief pursuant to the nuclear deal signed this summer, Hamas stands to benefit even more. Congress must stop these funds from flowing. Number 2, pressure Qatar and Turkey to stop supporting Hamas. Both countries, because of their status as U.S. allies, think they can support Hamas without being viewed as state sponsors of terrorism. Congress should not let this stand. Number 3, target the PLO. The PLO is technically the peace negotiating body for the Palestinians. In reality, it is a bloated and opaque organization that has consistently stymied diplomacy. Congress should consider punitive measures until the PLO halts its incitement. More broadly, it should rethink its recognition of the PLO. Number 4, investigate the Palestine National Fund. The PNF is the official financial organ of the PLO. PNF receives funding from the PA budget, to which America contributes 20%. The PNF uses its funds to help the families of, quote, martyrs, unquote, and it funds Palestinian media organs. Congress should determine whether the U.S. funds the PNF and take action accordingly. Number 5, stop the Palestine 194 campaign. When Israel responds to terrorist attacks, the Palestinian Authority alleges war crimes. This is part of a campaign designed to both delegitimize Israel and pave the way for unilateral declaration of statehood. Congress should clarify U.S. policy on this dangerous campaign. And finally, prepare for Palestinian succession. Washington must hasten the orderly exit of Mahmoud Abbas. After a decade of corruption and poor governance, he lacks the ability to lead. This has been made clear by his half-hearted stance on Palestinian violence. Now is the time to make plans for a new leader. Mr. Chairman, thank you again for inviting me here today. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Dr. Schanzer. Mr. Mikowski.
Chairman Royce, Ranking Member Engel, and distinguished members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity to discuss the situation in Jerusalem. In discussing it, we should be clear what I think we all agree on. There's no justification for any incitement to violence. When you say that Israel wants to change the status quo on the Temple Mount, Haram al-Sharif, it is equivalent to yelling fire in a crowded theater, giving the role that such allegations have played for in provoking violence in the past. I've added up just since 1991, when we've had these spurts, 269 people have been killed as a result of these allegations before the current round, which Chairman Royce mentioned. Secretary of State Kerry said in an interview on NPR last Friday, there's no excuse for the violence Palestinians need to understand, and President Abbas has been committed to nonviolence, but he needs to be condemning this loudly and clearly, and he needs to not engage in some of the incitement that his voice has sometimes been heard to encourage, so this has to stop. This incitement includes public remarks. As we've heard, every drop of blood spilled in Jerusalem is pure, every martyr will reach paradise, and every injured person will be rewarded by God. And Jews, quote, have no right to desecrate the mosque with their dirty feet. Yes, he has called for a nonviolent struggle in recent days, but the damage here is pretty strong. Sadly, this is not a new charge that Israel's out to destroy the mosque. Since the 1929 Hebron massacre, there have been, like I mentioned, several incidents, but a few things needs to occur to ensure that this pattern is not repeated. And I would just like to associate myself with some of the comments, like the idea of blacklisting people engaged in such incitement. I think even a congressional delegation to deal with your European counterparts who are also generous supporters of the Palestinians. There needs to be some sensitizing there. But when it comes to the Mount itself, there needs to be acknowledgement that the Temple Mount is holy to both Muslims and Jews. While Israeli leaders of all stripes have asserted the sanctity of the area to Muslims, the Haram al-Sharif, the reverse has not been the case. The Palestinian leadership does not acknowledge the site's historical significance for the Jewish people. At the Camp David summit in 2000, Yasser Arafat famously angered President Clinton by denying the temples even existed, saying they were located in Nablus or even in Yemen. Clinton reportedly responded that every Sunday school student in Arkansas knew that this was not the case. The vast majority of Jews in Israel around the world do not attempt to pray on the Temple Mount. From 1967 and on, its chief rabbin has forbidden Jews from visiting the area, believing this should not occur until the Messianic age. Yes, a few radical Israeli activists and even some politicians, including Agriculture Minister Uri Ariel, have recently visited the Mount. Yuval Diskin, the former head of the Shin Bet, echoed the view of many who urge not to allow this, saying that this is, quote, the most fuel-saturated, flammable area in the Middle East, end quote. To the credit of the Netanyahu government, it has refused to change the status quo. Ironically, the lack of acknowledgement on the Palestinian side was not always the case. A pamphlet for tourists published by the Supreme Muslim Council in 1924 says the fact that the Al-Aqsa is built on the site of the Solomon's Temple is, quote, beyond dispute. However, the intertwining of religion and nationalism ensured that the historical acknowledgement was erased. Of course, neither side has to accept the narrative of the other as sacrosanct, but if they can't acknowledge that the other side reveres the site as they do, violence is bound to continue, as we have seen. And it's very important that, we want to be clear that there are other factors here, but there's, like I said, no excuse for violence. What can be done in terms of the site? I think one thing is to help define the status quo, explicit set of understandings. It would add a measure of predictability. This means also the Jordanians, who would be aside to this, along with Israel and the Palestinians, Jordan being the custodian of the Temple Mount for the Arab side, would have to affirm that the status quo is indeed being maintained. Another idea, Israel is able to use social media when it comes to reaching Palestinians in Gaza, urging them to get out of harm's way. There's got to be a way for the startup nation with all its high-tech prowess to find ways to communicate directly to the smartphones and cell phones and text messaging on the Arab side. My final point is this, that as bad as the situation looks, it could get worse. It's important to remember that Israel and the Palestinian security officials are engaged in daily security cooperation that is vital to both sides. We're approaching the 20th anniversary of the killing of Yitzhak Rabin. Nobody could call Rabin a dreamy peacenik, yet he understood, I'd like to say in conclusion, that the traumas endured by Israelis and Palestinians require them to separate. This insight underscores the need to continue to work for separate political entities to give dignity to both sides. But the bloodshed in Jerusalem reminds us that the Palestinians need to come to terms with the fact that both sides have both political rights, but there's also, each side has a religious connection to the land. If that recognition is not reached, I worry that the violence will continue to periodically erupt and even intensify. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Mikulski. So in testimony here, one of the discussion points was the case of Mohammed Halabi, a 19-year-old who attacked an Israeli family with a knife, killing the father, injuring the mother, and the 2-year-old son. So we have somebody going after a 2-year-old with a knife. And I guess at this point, we're not surprised that he'd be honored. We're sort of used to that being a reaction. The question to me, what jumped out at me, was he was honored by the Palestinian Bar Association. So that's what I was going to ask the panel here. So he's given an honorary law degree. One would think that a society's lawyers might be a place to find some, moderation or tolerance in this debate, that they wouldn't jump to the conclusion that this individual who perpetrated the attack would be given a law degree. So if not among the bar, where can we find those forces among Palestinian society today? Mr. Mikulski.
Well, I would refer you to a colleague of mine, Mohammed Dajani, who's at the Washington Institute. He is a teacher at Al-Quds University. He took 29 Palestinian students of his to Auschwitz because there's been a lot of denial of the Holocaust. Now, sadly, when he returned, his car was torched. He lost his job, but he remains steadfast. He's now at the Institute. We hope he will be returning, and there's his movement to focus on moderation. But we need religious leaders, we need academics, we need all kinds of opinion shapers to be part of the solution and not part of the problem.
Well, one of the questions I would ask here is, with all of the donations made by the international community, why not textbooks that focus on history, focus on facts, focus maybe on coexistence, focus on something other than hate? I don't think it's a prerequisite that we have a lesson plan in there, but I've gone through these textbooks, and I know from an audit that we've had done here that there's some reversal from where we were, maybe 6 years ago with respect to UNRWA. But how would we substitute, instead of this message, and instead of the lesson plans, and I've seen footage of that and broadcasts, and I've talked to President Abbas about this issue, as has other members, Mr. Engel and other members of this committee. How could we sort of change the calculus here? Because it seems the central issue is, I think it was Mr. Abrams that said this, the central issue is that both political parties they've talked about incitement in terms of the White House, but we haven't had really a plan to make it a central issue that we substitute that kind of teaching. To me, it's like these 600 madrasas, or Deobandi schools, as they call them in Pakistan, that we know are teaching jihad, and they never are closed. We never substitute some lesson plan, or the government never does. Why not give lesson plans that prepare a pathway towards an understanding of the world, done in an objective framework?
I would just add what we said in our remarks about we need to socialize the Europeans. This message has to be heard in stereo, and they have tended to be more reflexive in their support of the Palestinian cause. And I think there needs to be a congressional plan to get this message out so the Palestinians are hearing it from all directions, not just from the United States?
Well, we'll work with you and put together a delegation and start a dialogue, because I think in real time, we ought to figure out a way to substitute the textbooks with lesson plans that will at least assist children in learning something other than the bombastic message that their goal in life should be to kill Jews.
I was just going to add, Mr. Chairman, I think rather than giving unearmarked cash budget support for the PA, earmark some of the funds for things like this new set of textbooks.
Mm-hmm. All right. I think my time has expired, or it's about to. I'll go to Mr. Engel of New York.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This breaks my heart. It really does. As someone who believes in a two-state solution, best for both peoples, I believe. This thing is spiraling out of control, and again, there can be no condoning acts of violence, acts of terrorism against innocent civilians. So we all agree the Palestinians must end their incitement to violence, case closed. But the problem really goes much deeper. For there ever to be a two-state solution, the Palestinians have to prepare their people for peace. And that means much more than simply stopping calls to jihad and armed struggle. It means accepting Israel's right to exist. It means openly acknowledging the almost 4,000 years of Jewish presence in the lands which are now Israel, and the deep connection of the Jewish people to this land. And it means joining in the effort to build a modern society on this ancient land, rather than stoking ancient hatreds to tear down the advances which modernity has brought. So let me just ask open-ended question. What can be done to encourage the Palestinians to prepare their people for peace? And many of us had such high hopes with the Oslo Accords. Has so much time passed since the Oslo agreements, and since there's been so many failures in the meantime, is this still even possible? Whoever would care.
I would just say briefly, Mr. Engel, I think there is a desire still for separation, at least on the part of the Israelis. The form of the separation is more under debate than the goal of separation. But here I would agree with David Makovsky. I mean, part of the problem is there's a lot of messages coming into Palestinians. They come from the Arab world, they come from the Europeans, and of course they come from the United States. And we can't control the other messaging, but we can perhaps try to influence it.
Congressman Engel, I would just add to what Elliot has just said, that I think so much of this just comes straight from the leadership. And again, I would point to not just, I mean, I know there's been a lot of focus on the PA, but I think so much of the messaging about Israel comes from the PLO and comes from Mahmoud Abbas himself. And I think one of the things that FDD has looked at is the question of succession. Can we begin to prepare for the exit of Mahmoud Abbas in an orderly way? But more importantly, can we begin to identify next generation leaders? One of the things that's happened in Mahmoud Abbas's term, he's now 10 years into a 4-year term with no signs of leaving, is that he has run out every possible challenger within that political system. And so it's all people who think the way he does and view the conflict the way he does. We need a next generation of leadership, and I think from there, change can begin to flow.
Let's go ahead.
What I try to say about my remarks about the security cooperation, and I'm glad you mentioned the support for two states, is whether it's Yuval Diskin, who was the head of the Shin Bet, whether it was Benny Gantz, who the former chief of staff of the IDF, who just spoke at my institute, you know, that security cooperation is vital for Israelis and Palestinians. I think Elliot mentioned, you know, the idea that Israel doesn't want a collapse because it would collapse in Israel's lap. So this is always why it's such a delicate dance. But maybe if we could do some of these, more targeted interventions, and the idea of earmarking for tolerance in the school books, I think is probably a good idea. That could be part of it. And I agree with Dr. Shanzer that that succession is a big issue. The question is, anything that the United States is seen to drive will be a kiss of death in that system, and so this is why it's complex. But clearly, he's someone who's turning 81 in March, and I think this issue of succession is vital. How it's done and who does it is where it gets complicated. And I just worry that if it's an American-led succession, he'll be called a puppet. I also would we have to be careful of unintended consequences. A few years ago, I think all of us warned that to cut off the money altogether, that Fayyad was the goose that lays the golden eggs, and without Fayyad, the goose goes if there's no more golden eggs. And sure enough, he was scapegoated for the stopping of money, even though he was against, he even broke his wrist on a coffee table, urging Abbas not to go the route he did at the UN, saying it would lead to a cutoff in funds. But it was he who was targeted. And so that's part of it, that we can have the best of intentions and we get the opposite results. It doesn't mean we should be paralyzed, but we should think about how we're going to get the results we want. That's all.
I'd like to ask quickly, because I know my time is up, but I just want to talk about Abbas for just a quick moment, because sometimes I think there's a split personality running the Palestinian Authority. On the one hand, President Abbas makes vile comments. He denies the historic Jewish connection to Israel and calls perpetrators of terrorist acts as heroes and martyrs, as you've all pointed out. On the other hand, he's also backed cooperation between Israeli and Palestinian security services in an effort to limit violence. So how should we interpret those mixed messages coming out of the PA? Can you help us understand more about President Abbas? Is there a method to his madness, or is he schizophrenic? I mean, what is, what is happening with him?
I'm going to speak for my colleagues. I just feel, look, there's another element of bitterness here that doesn't justify any violence. I keep repeating, no justification for violence. He did have death threats during the Intifada, the second Intifada, where he said that this that the second Intifada was wrong, and it certainly was counterproductive. There are times he said terrorism was morally wrong, I think during Elliott's time, and the polling numbers crashed. But he has been consistently against violence in the macro, saying you need security cooperation. But then look at this statement about every ounce of blood. So yeah, I don't know how to attribute it. I can't read his mind. He's vilified in the Palestinians for not being supportive enough of violence. But, as a leader, you have responsibility, and you can't escape that.
Eliana Ross-Leitonen.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to the witnesses. Sadly, when the PA incites violence and we see a terror attack or a continued increase in violent activity, as we have seen over the last month and a half, we find this wrong reflexive response from the international community to make a false moral equivalence between the PA and Israel. And what we see all too often is the unwillingness to call out Abu Mazen and the PA, all of their officials, for their reprehensible words and their actions without finding the need to also reprimand Israel. And that is that false moral equivalence. When it comes to the Palestinians, some do verbal gymnastics so as not to upset the fragile nature of Abu Mazen and the PA, but there's no such concern when it comes to blasting the Israelis. Some very lamely blame settlement activity by Israel as the justification for increased violence, instead of putting the blame where it should be, with the Palestinian Authority, with Abu Mazen, with their long-standing practice of inciting violence and hatred against Israel. Why is there this double standard that is applied to Israel? Why does the international community feel the need to handle Abu Mazen with kid gloves? And doesn't this send the wrong signal and essentially legitimizes Abu Mazen, emboldens his action to continue the acts of terror? And this incitement isn't just intended for the limited consumption of the Palestinian people, in recent years, as we have seen, Abu Mazen has taken his harmful rhetoric to the international stage, using the UN General Assembly and other UN bodies as the preferred platform to gather like-minded nations together in an attempt to delegitimize the Jewish state. We saw this several weeks ago when Abu Mazen addressed the UN General Assembly, announced that the PA is no longer bound by the Oslo Accords nor its international obligations. This is outrageous. He accused Israel of trying to change the status quo on the Temple Mount and threatened a religious conflict that would spread across Jerusalem and the Palestinian authorities. And what happened when he said that? We're no longer bound by the Oslo Accords. A standing ovation each time he said that. And now Abu Mazen has requested, and it's my understanding that it was granted, he's requested to address an emergency meeting of the Human Rights Council next week, where I think it's safe to say that he will make no attempt to diffuse the situation, but only to inflame the tensions. We have a great deal of leverage at the UN with many of the nations that encourage Abu Mazen's actions in that body. What steps can we take to get other nations at the UN to put pressure on Abu Mazen to desist with the incitement, with his harmful rhetoric, and instead begin working for the betterment of the Palestinian people and toward true peace with Israel? Mr. Abrams and anyone else.
Well, these are very difficult questions. I think he pays no price. That's the problem. He keeps doing it because he never pays a price for doing it. So what's the price? I mean, we've been reading these terrible quotes from him. So what happens this week? Gets a meeting with the Secretary of State. Now, will the Secretary of State come out and denounce him and condemn him? I don't think so. So the lesson he learns is it's okay. It's acceptable. And I think what he's doing, and this is an answer to Mr. Engel's question, actually, what is he doing? He is trying to keep calm in the West Bank. That's why there's security cooperation. Just like Hamas tries to keep calm in Gaza. But Hamas wants violence in Israel and the West Bank, and Abbas wants violence in Israel. He just doesn't want it back home in the West Bank. It's a very cynical game. And as long as he pays no price, he'll keep it up.
I would fully agree with Elliot. The only thing that I would add here, and I may sound like a broken record today, is that so much of this has to do with the question of succession. That Abbas has made it, I mean, it's a binary proposition. He's made it either it's Hamas or it's me. Right? So no one wants to touch him. You talk about why everybody handles him with kid gloves. Right? He's made it such that he says, I am the only thing standing in the way of Hamas taking over both the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. So you're going to play by my rules. And it's for that reason that we see, I think, the United States bending over backwards, refusing to condemn a lot of what he's done, because we don't see new opportunities around the bend for new leaders. Again, I'll stress that I think we need to begin to pave the way for succession. Abbas won't like it, that's for sure. But I can tell you this, that the guy is a pack-a-day smoker. He's not healthy. When he drops dead, we're going to have problems.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Brad Sherman of California.
I want to identify myself with the statements of the chair, the ranking member. We mourn for the victims of terror. We condemn the terrorists and those whose lies incite and glorify terrorism. We condemn those who reward terrorism with payments to the families of terrorists and with glorification of their deeds. Arab leaders have much to answer for. As to Israel, in the days of the Roman Empire, those zealots who claimed to be the most pro-Israel did enormous harm. So now we see a few fringe Israeli leaders who want to disturb the status quo on the Temple Mount. They too are harmful. They provide a pretext for those who incite terrorism in Israel and those who seek delegitimization abroad. As to a two-state solution, I don't blame those who are pessimistic. I would doubt the sanity of anyone who bubbled with optimism about a two-state solution. But those who don't voice pessimism about a two-state solution, but those few Israeli leaders who oppose a two-state solution also do immeasurable harm. The definition of insanity, of course, is to keep doing the same thing and expecting a different result. I've been here 19 years. I feel like it was just yesterday. We condemn what the PA does, we threaten, and then we continue to subsidize. So I want to focus my questions on whether we should change the nature of or eliminate or reduce our aid to the PA. Now, you gentlemen all have incredible backgrounds. Got constituents who are considerably simpler. They simply say, why are we giving the PA money? And it might be helpful to our efforts in the Middle East if we stopped. It might be helpful if we continued. Hard to tell except for one thing. We'd reduce the deficit by $500 million if we stopped giving money to the PA. That's the only thing that's certain. The biggest reason that's given to give money to the PA is that if we don't give them money, there'll be more acts of terrorism. I'll point to the policies of Thomas Jefferson, our first president to involve us in the Middle East, who refused to pay tribute to terrorists in the state of Tripoli. And the short-term result was additional terrorism focused on American ships in the Mediterranean. I'm not sure that it's a good thing to give money to people who say we're going to kill innocent folks if you don't give us money. Those are not good people. One approach would be, and also I'll point out, only in world affairs is it considered insulting or cruel to give somebody $400 million. But since we gave them $500 million last year, it is cruel. Anyone who wants to be cruel to me by delivering $400 million, I will provide my address at the end of these hearings. And I'll deal with the ethics committee later. I want to explore with you, what about the idea of at least cutting the aid and delivering not cash, but delivering food and delivering textbooks already printed, and guess what they're going to say about the history of the Middle East? Mr. Abrams.
I think you're absolutely right about the cash question, the budget support question. The budget support suggests trust in how they're going to spend the money. I don't think anybody has that trust anymore, so we should move to services rather than cash. The cash started with Salam Fayyad, actually. He's gone, so maybe the cash.
I had a little bit more trust back then.
Right.
Mr. Murkowski, what if we cut the aid to $250 million? Would the world come to the end?
No, the world won't come to an end. Look, I agreed with what Elliot said about earmarking funds for education and tolerance. Let's just say that we have cut off the funds before. And that was my comment, that when we did that, I think 2 or 3 times about the UN, we lost Fayyad. That doesn't mean we should be paralyzed. But I can tell you that talking to a lot of the Israeli security professionals who deal with this, they come to me and said, I pray America does not cut off the PA, because we work with them on a daily basis to fight terrorism. In the West Bank, of course. But it's hard for me to say I know better than you do when they are closer to the situation than I am, whether it's the Chief of Staff Gantz, whether it's Diskin, the head of the Shin Bet. So I think we have to think in different ways. And can I just say to Ms. Eliana Ross-Layton's point about the UN Human Rights Council and the UN system, we know there's double standards. How many times has the UN Human Rights Council condemned the carnage in Syria, where over 250,000 people have been killed, versus how many times do they condemn Israel? And so the problem goes way beyond Abbas.
The gentleman's out of time. We need to go to Mr. Chris Smith of New Jersey.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. It's great to see the 3 of our distinguished witnesses. Thank you for your insights and testimony. Secretary Abrams, you pointed out that incitement means teaching generations of Palestinians to hate Jews by demonizing and dehumanizing them, and teaching hate and terror by honoring terrorists. I've been very concerned about many of the statements coming from Prince Zayed of Jordan, the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, which always tilt heavily against Israel. They are one-sided, and to have a human rights point person in the United Nations taking such a one-sided position does grave damage to the truth. And I've been working on this issue, like perhaps not as much as Elliot Abrams, but for the 35 years that I've been here. And for 20 years, I've been raising the issue of UNRWA. Had several hearings on it, joined by Ileana Ross-Layton and Henry Hyde when he was chairman, and of course our distinguished chairman today, offered amendments on it, always getting back from UNRWA officials and State Department officials that they're working on it. They're trying to excise the textbooks from the virulent anti-Semitic hate that is contained within it. I remember at one of our hearings we talked about pep rallies, like American football game pep rallies, where terrorists were extolled and lifted up as heroes to young children who are obviously impressionable. So it's been many years, and we provide over $4 billion. We're the largest donor, $408 million in 2014. Closest contributor would be the European Commission at $139 million, and the UK at $95 million. So we are disproportionately the biggest contributors to UNRWA. So as you pointed out in your testimony, but you might want to elaborate on it, Mr. Secretary, UN Watch pointed out and was able to expose 12 UNRWA-linked Facebook accounts that incite violence. I've looked at each and every one of them. They are horrific. They've called on Ban Ki-moon, as well as the UNRWA chief, to fire these people. Have they fired them? Has a commission of inquiry been established, as was asked for by UN Watch? This is absolutely disgusting. Remember South Pacific, that famous song, "You've got to be taught"? You've got to be taught hate. And these children are being taught hate every single day, and our money is complicit in it. Secretary Abrams.
Thank you. Yes, as you know, many Palestinian children don't go to PA schools. They go to UNRWA schools. And UN Watch has found these employees who are teaching hate. I think you're asking the right question. So far as I'm aware, no one has been disciplined. No one has been fired. There's no commission of inquiry. The usual UNRWA response is a cover-up. And the hope that, you'll forget about this in a month. So I think it's really important that you don't let the State Department, the U.S. government, forget about this. Because, again, the lesson that's going to be learned by UNRWA is it doesn't really matter. They get angry for a week, and then it passes. And then it happens again and again and again. We know that there are lots of UNRWA employees in Gaza who are actually part of Hamas.
Let me ask you, Mr. Shanzer, you pointed out that Hamas stands to benefit from Iranians' $150 billion in sanctions relief. You might want to expound upon that. What do you think qualitatively and quantitatively that will give Hamas the ability to do?
Absolutely. It's a terrific question. Look, first of all, we're about to provide Iran with $150 billion. How that's dispersed over the next 10 or 12 years, I think, still remains to be seen. And we continue to hear from the administration that very little of that will go to terrorism. I think the thing that's probably important to point out here is that even, let's just say, 5% of that goes to terrorism, you're still looking at a huge sum. What that means practically for Hamas, you're going to be looking at cash transfers, which is hugely important for Hamas just to be able to maintain control over its territory. The tunnels have been cut off largely by Egypt, and so they're going to need cash to be able to pay salaries and to keep their security people on the streets. On top of that, there is the homegrown rocket-making ability that we have seen that Iran has been able to help Hamas develop over time. Tunnel drilling also, we believe, also comes from Iran on some level. And then, of course, the rockets that are imported in, the Fajr 5s and some of the other longer-range missiles that we saw fired into Israel last year during that 50-day war. So there's quite a bit of damage that can be done through these cash transfers, which we fully expect to take place largely to the Qassam brigades, the armed wing of Hamas.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for calling this important hearing.
Thank you, Mr. Smith. Mr. Albio Series of New Jersey.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for being here today. I'd like to associate myself with the comments my colleague from New Jersey made. When I look at this money, $500 million, this just brings back like almost a bribe to organized crime to keep peace in a certain section. I mean, I just don't know what stipulation are added to this money. I don't know if we require any strings attached to this money that would bring the violence down. I mean, we're losing generations of young Palestinians, and we're paying to have these young Palestinians become so radical. So it's almost like the history of organized crime. I don't know if I really do agree with the fact that we shouldn't cut out some of this money. You know, we're paying to keep peace in a certain section. I just have a, where do you think the surge of violence is going to end? You know, the stability and the influence of the Palestinian Authority, where do you think it ends if this doesn't end well? Can any?
Prime Minister Netanyahu made the comment about a week ago that these acts, these stabbings, are actually a form of suicide because you're almost certain to get killed by a police officer or a military person. And there's hopefully a finite number of Palestinians who want to commit suicide that way. We just don't know what the number is. I'm surprised, candidly, that we're into Thursday now and it's still going on. I really thought it would begin to burn out. And that's still my hope, that it will begin to calm down in the next few days.
There was an interesting article that appeared today by a former national security advisor to Netanyahu, who's now back into the private sector. His name is Yaakov Amidror. And he noted that more than 90% of the attacks have been taking place by residents of East Jerusalem. And so what we have is something very specific to these neighborhoods, these several 100,000 individuals. And, you know, to me, it's still unclear that it's entirely the PA or the PLO that is driving it, that it's entirely Hamas. Some of this really is grassroots or perhaps forces that we have not yet discovered. And so, you know, a lot of people are wondering whether this is a third intifada. It's hard to tell exactly what that means, but it's quite likely that we'll look back on this several months from now, and it could still be going. And this could be one of those events that doesn't have an official end.
Look, compared to the second intifada, within a month of the first, in the second intifada, we had 1,500 people injured. I mean, the order of magnitude we're facing now compared to 2000, 2004 is very small. And this is, if one life is taken, it's one life too much. So I want to be very clear about that. But this has not been a mass intifada that we saw. We know what that looks like. This is not it. Now, could there be like a Mohammed Dura incident? This boy was, where there was fabricated on TV, as if Israel killed him when that wasn't the case. And that brought a lot of people to the streets. That, I think, you know, could change the order of magnitude. I am concerned, though, that I hope this does not become the new normal, that a de facto binational reality sets in. I will just say, you know, what John Chancellor just said about the East Jerusalem neighborhoods, this has been an area where they're now moving the concrete dividers that have been outside these neighborhoods. Now there's a move with checkpoints to change that. So I tend to think that we could see changes in Jerusalem as well as a result of this violence, with the barriers being
I just have one last, you know, do you believe that the status quo surrounding the Temple Mount can be maintained after this?
I just like to repeat, I hope if Secretary Kerry over there could help reach a set of understandings. It maybe not could be formalized, but a set of delineated understandings of what is the status quo. So we'll know if there's a change to it, but that requires the Jordanians as the custodians. Last year, Kerry, Abdullah, and Netanyahu totally ended the violence in Amman last November. It was a great success story for the United States, but I think there needs to be some sort of a delineation. I think that would be very important in my view, but it requires the Jordanians to do something they don't want to do, which is publicly step up when Israel maintains a status quo. They might want to whisper that, but whispers doesn't help us unless they say it publicly, and we don't see that right now.
Thank you, Mr.
Thank you,
Sears.
Chair.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Sears. And now we turn to Mr. Salmon of Arizona. Mr. Salmon.
Madam Chairman, I'm going to yield back my time. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Duncan?
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. You know, I've met with Benjamin Netanyahu, as many of us have. And one thing that really stuck out with me in our meetings was a commitment to Israel to even having a conversation about a two-state solution, but they had one request, that the Palestinians recognize their right to exist. You know, there's a simple solution to get everybody at the table to talk about a solution, and that's just acknowledge each other's right to exist. One side of the equation is not willing to do that. My appeal to the Palestinians is acknowledge Israel's right to exist, but what we see going on is this talk about removing their access to the Western Wall. If you look at the history of the Western Wall, it was a place the Jews were able to go and worship. There was an area that was given to them. It was a trash dump. The Muslims that controlled the Temple Mount threw their rubbish over, oftentimes feces and garbage, and that, it's not the case now, but that's the history. And now we're hearing that we're going to even take the Western Wall away from the Israelis. A simple solution is recognition of a right to exist. So I'll move on. What can we do? What can the administration do? What can Congress do to stop this violence? I want to say that in a prepared testimony last February, Dr. Schanzer, I apologize, stated, "I don't believe that peace between the current leaders is likely, nor do I believe that this administration has earned the trust of either side. However, the next set of leaders may well make progress. But even if deadlock persists, Washington cannot abdicate its role as the honest broker. Once we return to that role, we may have an opportunity to call for a halt to all unilateral activity and guide this conflict toward a more constructive dynamic." I thought pretty wise, clairvoyant words there. What advice do you have for Congress to play a role in this? Future leaders. We got a presidential election. We may have someone that looks at this situation a little differently, that looks at the role of America differently in negotiating peace. And so I'm asking you, what advice do you have to the United States Congress here in October of 2015 to play a role in minimizing, if not eliminating, the senseless violence? Now, I asked Dr. Schanzer there, but I'll be glad to move on. Let's let him answer first, and we'll come to you.
Sure. Well, thank you, Congressman Duncan. Look, what I would want to stress right now is that America does not intend to abdicate its leadership role in the region. I think a lot of actors in the Middle East right now have given up on the United States, that we have rolled over on Iran, that we have declined to battle ISIL, and that in general we have had a more hands-off approach to the region, a so-called rebalancing of our foreign policy or a pivot to Asia or whatever you'd like to call it. But we need to make it very clear to the region that we intend to re-engage. And I would argue that America has been the most effective in its peacemaking opportunities when it has demonstrated its strength. So if you look after the first Gulf War, that was the moment where the United States demonstrated that it was not going to take no for an answer. That's when the Israelis and the Palestinians fell in line and began to work with the administration toward peace. I look forward to a day where we can, again, look to American strength as leading the way in the region.
Well, I appreciate that, and I agree with what you've said. I think our allies don't trust us and our enemies don't fear us. And a strong America is, and our presence in certain regions is very unifying force. And Mr. Makovsky.
Look, I tend to use sports analogies a lot, so I hope you'll indulge me. The last 3 times that we've been involved, 2000 with Camp David, 2007-8, Condoleezza Rice, the Annapolis process. The process I was involved in with Secretary Kerry as well. There was an effort made from the top levels to try to hit the home run ball, so to speak, and solve the whole conflict. It was very admirable. Secretary Kerry was relentless in putting in a lot of effort. But I think what these 3 efforts have shown us is that these leaders are not able to do the end game. I would rather us see some singles, some doubles, and to try to do what we can do, because whenever we try to hit that home run ball, we could strike out.
Reclaiming my time real quick in 3 seconds. Israelis pulled out of the settlements. They made a good faith effort. From that point forward, rockets continued to fly into Israel until last summer. I think Israel's made a good faith effort. It's time for the Palestinians to make a good faith effort.
Thank
And I
you,
yield
Mr.
back.
Duncan.
I agree.
Mr. Deutsch, my South Florida colleague.
Thanks. Thanks very much, Madam Chairman. Mr. Mikowski, can we start with a focus on the security cooperation that exists currently between the Palestinian security and the Israelis? I'd like to probe that a little because given the extent of that cooperation, everything that we've been discussing this morning makes no sense in terms of the actions and statements that President Abbas makes. But can you just confirm the extent of that cooperation?
So, Congressman Deutsch, you have a situation that, you have the Central Command, the West Bank Command of the IDF, you have the Shin Bet. They are working with their Palestinian colleagues to keep Hamas out of the West Bank and to keep things quiet. And I would say that it has been successful, not judging by my standard, by what, I quoted Gantz and Diskin as saying that that's why there's been quiet. And if you got rid of that, then what you would have is Hamas more in the West Bank, the PA probably more overrun. So I think that security cooperation is indispensable going forward. And I think we have to be very careful by, to say, well, we don't need it because it's somehow a graft payment. I don't see it that way. I see it as Israelis and Palestinians really interpreting what peace should mean, which is working together for security. So I would just be very cautious before I would take that piece out, given that it's shown tangible results. And this was not always the case. In the 90s, things were very politicized. These were politicians, Jabril Rajoub, Mohammed Dahlan. These are now professionals on the Palestinian side, and the Israelis think very highly of them.
So here's what's so puzzling, I think, to so many of us. We spend all this money providing assistance that contributes to security for Israelis and Palestinians, that keeps Hamas out. And then President Abbas, you brought up the prior example. President Abbas then goes on TV and says that Israel is summarily executing 13-year-old kids, despite the fact that, one, he was still alive being treated by Israel, and two, had perpetrated a terrorist act. And when he does that, and when he engages in this incitement, all of the dollars that we spend on security to help secure the Israelis and the Palestinians from Hamas attacks becomes less effective because his statements only make the situation worse and embolden those who would ultimately be supportive of Hamas. Isn't that the case? Dr. Chancer, isn't that the case?
Look, it is the case, and part of the problem here is that Abbas is I think, trying to struggle with some competing interests. On the one hand, he does need to maintain that absolute iron grip over the West Bank, and he needs Israel 100% in order to do that. He cannot do it himself. I've heard estimates that if the Israelis were to stop cooperating with the PA, that in less than a month, the West Bank could be overrun. At the same time, he's got his political constituents who don't like the fact that he is working with the Israelis, and so there's a popularity issue, and of course, his popularity has been sagging for quite some time because of corruption, because of poor governance, because he's not been able to unify the territories, et cetera. And so you see him sort of, neither here nor there. And then more broadly, there's this question of ultimately his goal of establishing a Palestinian state. And the longer that he does not achieve that, the more frustration we see from him, and some of these bombastic statements, I think, are absolutely a result of that. Ironically, I think a lot of that comes from his own diplomatic positions. I think he's had opportunities to negotiate peace, and he's stepped away from that several times.
And how does, just the last question I'd ask is, how is it that, and I mean this sincerely, but how does he get away? How is it somehow acceptable to make an assertion about the religious sites that is patently false, and then have that assertion become a talking point that, that many around the world start to adopt. How does that happen? Mr. Abrams, you have thoughts on that?
Well, there are lots, there's a discourse out there that is filled with lies about Israel, and this just becomes another small piece of that discourse. People will believe almost anything. And I think, unfortunately, in the Arab world, it's very common that people assume that their leaders are lying to them half the time. So the fact that he is lying to people, not such a big deal, unfortunately.
So, Madam Chairman, I would conclude by saying that while I acknowledge the importance of our security assistance, I think it's very important. This has to be, these statements and these actions have to be relevant to our debates. And for those in the region who have said they don't care how Congress views this, there is a lot at stake in terms of their own security in the way we address this, and we are paying close attention. It does matter, and I thank the witnesses for their testimony today.
Thank you, Mr. Deutsch. Mr. Meadows is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Thank each of you for your testimony today. I guess this comes a little bit personal to me in that I just returned from Israel, in fact, still on jet lag, having arrived on Monday, spending a week up close and personal with a number of these terrorist attacks, changing our plans as we were there on the ground, with a number of our security detail concerned about where we were going, where we were not going. And indeed, 10 minutes after we left a particular area, it was reported that the very place that we left, there was an attack by a Palestinian dressed as a reporter on either IDF or / police security forces right where we were. Now, I find that interesting because all of this incitement that continues to go on, and I agree with some of the other statements that have been made, because I've tried to work on eliminating the money for the Palestinian Authority if it's going to be used to pay terrorists a stipend. And I say not only a stipend, it's actually a very good salary where they can be incentivized to complete and conduct terrorist activities. I find it just mind-boggling that we would continue to do that. That being said, I do agree that the Palestinian Authority, from a standpoint of security, provides a meaningful tool to work with the Israeli government, and so it is more complex than perhaps this guy from North Carolina could figure out. That being said, it is important that the truth be told. And the truth is that with regards to the Temple Mount, where there may have been a few comments that have been made by Israelis on one extreme, that the government in itself is not trying to change it. The only person who couldn't go to the Temple Mount was not the Muslim worshipers. It was this member of Congress that couldn't go because it was not safe for me to do that. Now, I say that because somehow in this whole narrative, what we're finding, and I normally ask questions, but today is my chance to make a statement, we are missing the fundamental question of incitement and how we are either ignoring or not addressing the issue as a nation who can address it. I was in a courtroom where there were 6 defendants there who had been accused of terrorist activities, 5 of those Hamas-related, 1 of those ISIS-related, and with the pride in their face as they talked to back and forth to members of their families and friends, almost cheering the fact that they were there sitting trial and being applauded as heroes. Enough is enough. And what we must do is put pressure on our European allies to address this particular issue. That is where it is. We may stand firm, but let this day be the start of where our European allies understand that they must join us in this fight to make sure that the incitement is eliminated. Now, with that, I would be, in the time remaining, I would ask, how do we start to provide services for the Palestinian Authority versus cash payments, where we can perhaps still provide the security-related issues that are out there. Is there a creative way for us to address this and finally have a resolve where we can do that? Anybody that wants to, Secretary.
No, just a quick idea. Just earmark everything. No unearmarked budget support. I mean, if you want to dock one particular thing, do it. If you want more for education, do it. Just don't give any unearmarked cash.
Well, Mr. Abrams, let me go with that, because at a table very much like yours, I talked to the Undersecretary of State almost a year ago and said that this money that was going for paying of terrorists, that program was going to go away. And indeed, it went away from there, but only shifted to another area, which says, well, it's not here in this pot, it's in a different pot. When are we going to address that? That one area. Go ahead.
Look, this is why what you said about the Europeans, I just want to say amen, amen, because this is what's required. We can't do this by ourselves. And if we have a quartet with the Europeans dealing with the Palestinian issue, administration, I think there needs to be more consultation with the funding arms in Europe. I'm not saying we'll succeed immediately, but we need to start with awareness. I also want to say, because we've been talking about security, and I also think that some of the people-to-people programming that does go on, I don't like to say any of this is a panacea. I know there's some effort now, ALMEP, a coalition of people-to-people trying to see what can be done on conflict resolution. I think that's a good idea. I think that's one piece. There's going to be 20 different pieces to this puzzle. Earmarking could be a piece, but consultation with Europe, I think, is critical. People-to-people is a piece of this. There's going to be a lot of different pieces if we're serious about taking this issue on.
Just a quick note that the funding that you're talking about, the PA funding for prisoners, ultimately, as I understand it, was moved over to the PLO. And again, I think we have to just note that the PLO has outlived its usefulness. It's no longer actually a partner in peace. It's supposed to be the negotiating partner for the PLO. It's not doing that. Instead, what we're seeing is the funding of prisoners. On top of that, we're seeing the funding of these media organs that have been spreading lies about the Temple Mount. And so I really think that we need to see a significant overhaul of the PLO. Perhaps Congress could begin to weigh whether we want to continue to recognize the PLO in light of its recent activity.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Mr. Meadows. Mr. Cicilline of Rhode Island.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you to our witnesses for being here. I, like my colleagues, am incredibly disturbed by the recent events and really want to join in all the strong condemnation of this recent round of violence, and particularly associate myself with the chairman and ranking members' earlier comments. And I'm particularly concerned about the incendiary and irresponsible words and texts that have played a leading role in this volatile situation. The bottom line is that terrorist acts of violence are being perpetrated against Israelis, and this must be strongly condemned by all parties, particularly by the Palestinian Authority. I want to note that yesterday I joined every single member of the Jewish caucus in Congress in issuing a statement rejecting the irresponsible and factually inaccurate resolution passed by UNESCO Executive Board, which falsely blames Israel for the recent surge in violence. One-sided inflammatory statements like this are part of the problem. They fan the flames of hatred and prevent us from moving forward in cooperation in a peace process that could lead to a two-state solution. And Mr. Chairman, with your consent, I wish to enter this statement into the record.
Objection so ordered.
Thank you. And I thank you for your testimony. And in particular, I thank you, Mr. Abrams, because in your testimony you spoke about one case in particular, the case of Dalal Maghrabi, one of the most deadly terror attacks in Israeli history, where 37 civilians, 12 of them children, were killed in the hijacking of a bus. And this was glorified by naming schools and summer camps and sports tournaments after this terrorist. And it's just one example of the kind of glorification of terror and violence that continues to persist in the Palestinian Authority. And so my first question is, are there any alternative Palestinian voices coming from the PA or society more broadly that is calling for Palestinians to cease these recent acts of terror?
There are, and we can point to, for example, former Prime Minister Fayyad is an example of this, and there are clearly many others. The problem has been that the leadership has been the same group. First it was Arafat, now it's Arafat's survivors and acolytes, starting with President Abbas, who are in charge. They're in charge of the PA. They're in charge of the PLO, they're in charge of Fatah, and you're not getting that kind of cooperation from them.
Also, I know for many years, the educational system in the West Bank and Gaza and in other parts of the region have really put forth dangerous, inaccurate perceptions about Jews and Israelis and sort of fostered a lot of the hatred. And I know there's been a lot of conversation. I spoke to President Abbas about this myself several years ago, and there were assurances they were working on this. Is there any evidence that there have been sort of any progress in terms of the curriculum and the textbooks? And to your earlier point, has the time come that we simply do not provide educational aid in terms of financial resources, but provide the actual textbooks that reflect the kind of curriculum that will foster understanding and a kind of more sort of a context in which a relationship can actually develop between two communities?
I think it goes forward and backward. There is sometimes a new textbook that's better, then a few years later, a worse textbook comes out. I think part of the answer is to insist more. It may be to see if we can provide textbooks, including textbooks that have been done in Arabic in other places in the world, including the US. There's an UNRWA problem because about so many tens of thousands of Palestinian children aren't going to PA schools, they're going to UNRWA schools, which have their own textbooks. And finally, there's this PLO problem that Jonathan Schanzer was referring to, and which leads me to say it's time to close the PLO office in Washington.
And I just want to say, I think that this question of how do we stop the next generation of engaging in the same kind of behavior really does start with education. And I'd love to hear more, Mr. Abrams, right after Mr. Snowers goes about closing the PLO offices here.
Yeah, actually, I wanted to just mention something about the textbooks. Like, I think without question, the textbooks are a problem, and we've continued to focus on that here in Washington. But so much of this has to do with the teachers themselves. Right? What is taught in the classrooms comes down to the people who are teaching it. And so you've got a Ministry of Education problem. You could change the textbooks all you want, and the teachers could still teach their children that Israel is the enemy or that Israel doesn't exist on a map. And so it's a much more systemic problem than just textbooks.
Yeah, very important point. And Mr. Abrams, with my last few seconds, would you speak a little bit about why you think closing the PLO offices is a good strategy?
First, because of the way in which the PLO has been conducting itself, but secondly, because nobody elected the PLO. Once upon a time, there were PA elections. PLO is a non-democratic body. PLO does not, in fact, represent the Palestinian people, even though the UN thinks it does. So, in my own view, they're not doing anything helpful.
Thank you. I thank you, Madam Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Cicilline. Dr. Yoho.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Gentlemen, I appreciate you being here. And, you know, you wonder about the increased escalation of violence in that region. And I look at, you know, this administration. I remember Nancy Pelosi, John Kerry, if I remember correctly, saying that Hamas was a humanitarian organization and giving them credibility. And I hear the President saying the acts of terrorism that Israel's conducting or what Israel's going through are acts of terrorism, yet they're just trying to defend their people. You know, and you wonder why things are escalating. I see that happening, and Mr. Abrams, you were talking about getting new books into the schools. You know, as Dr. Schanzer pointed out, it's much deeper than that systemically, because the books aren't going to change anything. The children are a product of their environment. Their environment are the parents, it's the society, it's government. And until you change that, it's not going to happen. And to go in and say we need to have you didn't say regime change, but that's what I'm hearing from you guys. And I think we've meddled too much in too much of that. That's got to come from within. We can't give it outside. And as Mr. Makovsky said, you know, it'll be a puppet of the U.S., and we've done that over and over again. We can't do that. So this is a much deeper problem, and we had introduced here over a year ago a resolution to pull all funding from the Palestinian Authority, because our hardworking American taxpayers are paying taxes that go in the name of peace to the Middle East, and we've just seen an escalation. It's not working. So my goal is to remove all funding from the Palestinian Authority. I think your idea, which I do agree with, of closing the PLO office, I think that's another step that we should go into. But just to go on and doing what we're doing, I've only been here 3 years, but I've seen an escalation in violence. We had the war last year that went on for, what was it, 6 weeks? You know, and we're giving all this money, $500 million roughly a year, and I agree with my colleague, Mr. Sherman, that that money should go to deficit reduction in America, where it'll make a difference here. And, you know, what can we do different than what you've said? I mean, the textbooks, to me, yeah, that's a nice thing. It'll make us feel good because they won't have all this inflammatory language, but it's a lot deeper than that. I just know doing what we're doing is not going to work. You well know what the definition of insanity is. I would like to see a whole different paradigm shift in our foreign policy, that we support people that are on the same page as we are. I don't want them to live like us. I don't want to tell them what kind of government, but they should believe the people that we assist, I would think, are the same, the countries that believe in the same ideals we do: life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, religious freedom. I'm not going to dictate that to anybody, but if you want our help, you need to come to this side of the table. What are your thoughts on changing that whole narrative and paradigm?
I'll just very briefly say this, that I think one of the biggest problems with our relationship with the Palestinians is that it is transactional, not transformational. That we simply fork over funds and we have sort of expectations that they just keep the peace. And by the way, that was the same paradigm that we had with Egypt and many of the authoritarian governments that have collapsed over the last 5 or 6 years, and we see how that's worked for us. And so ultimately, I think we have to come to the conclusion that this is a failed paradigm. This is not to say that in our attempts to transform Palestinian society that we need to be the people who are dictating exactly who comes in and how they operate, but I think we can begin to set standards, right, for elections, making sure that, people, as in the case of Mahmoud Abbas, that he's not, now he's 10 years into his term, he's got no sign of going anywhere. We need to make sure that there are at least some semblances of democracy, of participation in that society, and I think it's at that point that we begin to see some of the changes that may be worth funding in the PA. But the one word of warning here is that if you just remove the entire infrastructure by defunding it, you've got the potential for chaos, and that's what we've got to try to avoid.
I would, if I could, look, I agree with this last point of John. We got to be careful that we think we just get rid of the old infrastructure, that things will be better when things we know are going to get worse. We know it. And we've withheld funding before. It's not like we haven't tried it. We've tried a different paradigm, and we didn't get the result we wanted. I do think, though, out of this hearing is coming some real ideas. I mean, I think you've heard from the three of us. John and Elliot have been talking about, closing the PLO offices, which I think could be a signal. I think the idea of blacklisting people who we know are involved in incitement, earmarking funds for things we believe in, the issue of trying to get European awareness so we're not on this incitement focus by ourselves. We need to. These are 4 different things that are not being done now.
All right. I tell you what we'll do is, our office, and I know the chairmans, they will go ahead and probably go along with this. Our resolution to defund the $500 million until Palestine got rid of Resolution 21 and 23. We did that. They got rid of those resolutions, but we know that money's fungible and it's still being sent over there. It's still being used somewhere that is aiding them to be able to pay the stipends to people in prison. So I like those recommendations, and I'm sure you'll see those come out soon. And I appreciate your time, Madam Chair. Thank you for
Thank you so much, Dr. Yoho. And as we recess our hearing, I want to notify our members that we will commence our markup of House Resolution 293 at approximately noon. Without objection, we are in recess.